Hello guys, and welcome back to the 1970 Pontiac Firebird Revell kit. This is the commission build for the MRS hobby store. So when we last left off, we put a coat of clear on there, actually a couple coats. I might have put too much clear on there. I was just trying to get a little bit of a smooth surface for our decals, but as we can see in there, it's kind of got some dust specks and some orange peel and stuff, so we'll need to work on that. So I just want to basically knock down the dust and a little bit of the orange peel to get a smooth finish for our decals. And I'll be wet sanding that a little bit. I'm just going to use, so this is a 3000 grit sandpaper, and like I said, I'm barely using any pressure. I just want to kind of knock off the dust and just kind of smooth the surface a little bit. So we'll go through and we'll do that on the entire body, and then we'll be ready for some decals. Alright, so I got kind of the dust taken off. So I went and replaced my water bucket, just cleaned it out, put some fresh water in there, and then made it warm. For some reason, the warm water tends to help release it from the backing paper a little bit faster. So for those of you following along, in the instructions, we are going to be using the number A build, which is the blue body, and the B build is the white body. So we'll be using the A build, and I'll be using that as my reference for my decal placement. To get the decals off, sometimes I'll just use my hobby knife. I do have some small scissors also that work really well, so we can do that. I just find sometimes my knife just is a little bit easier and quicker to use, and get around the edges a little bit if I need to. So we'll start with that one. Actually, I'm going backwards. For alignment purposes, I was just thinking that through. You can either put some tape on the body and kind of measure it out that way, but since the hood decal has to be centered for the hood scoop, then that's probably the one I'm going to be using for my measurements, my references, to get the rest of them measured, which means then I need to do the roof and then the trunk last. Make sure set those aside so they don't get wet and drop water onto them. If you're not ready to take the decals off yet, that will kind of ruin them. So we'll let those soak up for a minute. So to aid in decal placement and setting, we're going to be using our Tamiya Mark Fit solution. So we'll just brush a little bit of that where we want our decal to kind of help in placement. Those numbers, I should have moved those numbers out of the way first, but be careful of those. They're going to get in the way. They'll add little, you can see they kind of come apart, and they'll leave little decals in places where you don't want them. Once we get our decal positioned to where we want it, then we can start kind of, all I'm doing is just rolling. I'm using the Q-tip as a roller to just try to roll out any leftover moisture, water, setting solution underneath that decal, any air bubbles. Just trying to roll to the outside edges to help that decal set down nice and flat. Some of that will kind of flatten out also as the decal sets up. As it dries, it'll kind of shrink down a little bit. So if there's a little bit of bubbles or wrinkles, just small wrinkles, they should kind of flatten out after as it starts to set up. All right, let's let those decals set up. So we've got that clear coat on there. And like I said before, the Tamiya clears have always been really soft for me. And to include, even when I was putting on these decals, I was really struggling. I was getting some fingerprints and print marks and just really struggling with that clear. But I got the decals on, and I decided to try to go ahead and clear coat over it again to see if I could salvage some of those print marks and some of the damage that I had done to the clear coat. And it looks pretty good. I'm gonna get this cleaned up. I'm gonna sand it down with some 2000 sandpaper, wet sanding it. But I started doing some research while I was letting that cure up. And I found out that, so I was mixing my clears with the acrylic thinner, because on the bottle it says acrylic paint. To me, acrylic paint, so I was just using the acrylic thinner. But again, doing some research on Tamiya's website, they said that if you wanted a harder finish, you can actually use Tamiya's lacquer thinner. So that's what I did with this coat, is I used the same Tamiya clear, but I thinned it with the lacquer thinner instead, and it really made a big difference. This clear coat is a lot more durable, a lot harder. So I don't have to strip it and start over again. So I'm gonna go ahead and start, just get some wet sanding on this, just to get it cleaned up and get some of the dust spots out of there. I wanna get some more of the side marker decals on, do some detail painting on the door handles, the Pontiac logo on the back, and then I'm gonna let that dry up, and then I'm gonna clear coat it again for my final coat. You can still see the decals raised in the clear coat, so we'll get that sanded down, get the details added on, and then we'll hit it with some clear again. All right, so we've got the body scuffed up a little bit, sanded down. Just got some of that dust removed. Smoothed off some of the edges on my decals. Now we don't want to go too deep. We don't want to start sanding all the way through the clear coat into our decals. So just be a little careful with that. All right, so let's get ready for the rest of our decals. Now I usually just use my instructions just to kind of keep track of where I'm at. So I know I've already put that one on. I've put that one on. So I want to start doing these side marker decals now, and then the 455 HO engine designator. The door handles and the rear Pontiac emblem, I'm actually going to paint those on by hand. I can't ever get the decals to lay perfectly over the raised lettering. It always looks just a little bit off, so I'm going to do those by hand because I think they turn out a little bit better. So let's start doing that. So for my detail painting, I'm going to be using the Vallejo Chrome. Shake that up just a little bit. I'm just going to be using the Vallejo airbrush thinner to clean my brushes. Just put a little bit on a rag and wipe it off. One of the reasons I like using the Vallejo water-based paints for doing some of this detail stuff is if you get a little bit somewhere you don't want, it kind of just comes off pretty easily. For the door locks and the trunk lock, we're just going to be using a Maltol liquid chrome. This is actually to refill the chrome pens. I will just drip a little bit out, and then I'm going to trim off a little bit of the end of a toothpick. That way it gives me a little bit more surface for the paint to adhere. Alright, so once again we'll let that dry up, and then we'll go get another coat of clear on it. Alright, so we've got our final couple coats of clear on there. Again, I always get dust in my stuff, so we're going to cut that down a little bit. We're going to wet sand it down with some 3000 just to lightly go over it, just to get the dust specks out, and a little bit of orange pill. Even out those decals a little bit more. And then we'll polish it out, and then we'll be ready to move on to the rest of the interior parts. So again, I like to start with the least aggressive, so I'm going to start with the 3000 grit sandpaper. Okay, so it looks like that 3000 grit sandpaper is actually working for what I want it to do, so I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to finish wet sanding the entire car down. We'll get it ready for some polish. Alright, so we've got her sanded down, ready for some polish. So pay attention, for you competition builders, pay attention to your seams. Sometimes you'll get buildup around there that you'll want to smooth out. Judges are going to look for that. But overall, that's looking pretty good. Let's get some polish going. So for polish, I'll just be using a small microfiber cloth, a bunch of automotive grade finishing polish that I got from a friend. I've used some of this before, and this works pretty good as well. I just got this from an auto parts store. So any kind of automotive grade finishing polish you want to use, I think is fine. You just gotta try some things and see what works for you. So let's get to polishing. So sometimes you're going to get polish in between your seams and grooves and stuff. So when I'm done, I'll go take the car to the sink, and I have a paintbrush with some fine bristles that kind of get into the grooves a little bit. Don't use a toothbrush. It's a little too abrasive. It'll kind of scratch up your finish a little bit. But I just use a paintbrush with kind of some stiff bristles, and it just it'll take that polish right out of those grooves. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get this finished up off camera, so you guys don't have to sit there and watch me polish the whole car out. It's gonna take some time. So we've got it all polished up, looking nice and shiny. Next we're gonna work on the chrome trim around the windshield and the rear window, and then the B-pillars on the doors. So we'll be doing that. We'll be using bare metal foil. You can get this at MRS Hobby, mrshobby.com. A couple other tools we'll be using. One thing you want to use is make sure you have a very sharp new X-Acto blade. If it starts to get a little bit dull, it'll actually tear the foil. And then just a toothpick for burnishing down, getting around the corners. Q-tips. These work pretty good. They come apart pretty easily, so be careful with those. And then these are just some finer Q-tips, fine point Q-tip. These are a little bit harder, and these are made by Tamiya, and you can get both of these at MRS Hobby as well. Some tweezers, and then a ruler for measuring. This is a 1/25 scale ruler. I got this at MRS Hobby as well. So let's get going. There's a couple of different ways you can do the bare metal foil. Some guys will actually cut an entire sheet and spread it over the entire surface so they don't have any seams. I like to do just the smaller sections. You will have seams, which is actually pretty prototypical anyway, but it uses a lot less of the bare metal foil, which is kind of expensive, so I don't want to just be burning that up. So I just like to cut it in small strips and put it on that way. But whatever you choose to do, there's a couple of different ways to do it. When you're burnishing this down, the back side of this bare metal foil does have a sticky substance, so that it'll stick to the parts that you want it to. So be careful just to burnish it where you want it to go, so just around the trim, because if you accidentally start burnishing it onto the body, it's pretty tough to get off, so be careful with that. With the blade, you don't want to use a lot of pressure. You just kind of want to let the blade kind of glide across the seam. So a lot of times with this bare metal foil, it'll have that sticky residue that helps it stick to where you want it to go. But sometimes that residue will stick to or get onto your body. You can use a little bit of soapy water solution or whatever. A friend of mine actually told me that the super glue kicker, the accelerator, actually takes it off, and it does really well. So we'll get that cleaned up a little bit, and then I'm going to paint. A lot of times sometimes it's a little difficult with those corners when you do the single strips to get it to lay down in the corners right. Sometimes it'll peel up, like you can see in that corner. In that corner, I'll just touch that up with a little bit of chrome Maltol paint, and it should be good to go. All right, so to clean the body off, I'm just going to use my Duplicolor wax and grease remover. Just get a little bit on a microfiber cloth, just to kind of keep it clean, take the fingerprints off, dust, and other contaminants that kind of tend to get on there when you're handling your models as you're working on them. All right, looks like I got a little tiny bit of residue. Just want to use a little bit of this kicker and just take that residue off. Yep, it just comes right off. So once again, I'll be just using my Maltol liquid chrome pen refill. It's kind of handy to just drop out some little bit of paint that you can use. Just touch up those corners. Perfect. All right, she's coming along. So we're gonna let that dry up and we're gonna move on to the interior. We'll get the start on the interior parts, the chassis, the engine, all those components, and we'll see you on the next video.